We would like to thank you all for attending the 2021 U.S.-Japan Relations Yearbook Conference. This is a presentation of selected students' research from the Spring 2021 class, U.S.-Japan Relations in Global Context, taught by Professor William Brooks. The class culminates in a publication by the Reischauer Center that contains all of the students' research. Students spend the entirety of this semester developing their papers and interviewing organizations, government officials, and Japan ministries, among many others. We deeply appreciate all of the work they have done to be here today. The conference today will be held in two panels. The first, moderated by Dr. Brooks, will focus on political and military issues. The second, moderated by Dr. Fumiko Sasaki, will address social and environmental issues in Japan. So, without further ado, let me welcome Dr. William Brooks. Dr. Brooks has been a professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies since 2010 after retiring from the Department of State. For 15 years, he served as head of Embassy Tokyo's Media Analysis and Translation Unit, responsible for analyzing the impact of Japanese media trends on U.S. interests. He had two earlier postings to Embassy Tokyo's economic section and also served as a senior research analyst at the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. He has a doctorate from Columbia University and taught history at the university level, including SAIS, before entering government service. Thank you. We look forward to your speech.
Thank you, Monica, for the very nice introduction. It's really a pleasure to participate in the rollout of the Reischauer Center's yearbook on U.S.-Japan relations. A yearbook which has been published by SAIS since the mid-1980s. I do not know of any other publication or any other course which focuses on such a research project in the United States. And in the course that I teach, U.S. and Japan in Global Context, the students research and write original scholarly papers on a policy relevant topic. And these papers are then severely graded and edited and compiled into a published book. This year's edition, which is available on the SAIS Reischauer Center website, give it a look. This year's edition contains 8 papers, and 5 of the authors are here today in this rollout to tell us what they learned in their research projects. But before I start, I would like first to thank Monica Weller, student, author, and editor-in-chief of this publication for her hard work throughout the semester and all summer, as well as Neave Denny, the Reischauer Center coordinator and executive editor of the yearbook. They also set up today's rollout, which is being recorded and will be visible on the SAIS Facebook website. And to all the authors, I thank you for your hard work in bringing this yearbook to a successful fruition. It was a difficult year because of the pandemic. Just a word first about the research process that went into the this edition of the yearbook. And of course, we, for the second year in a row, had to deal with the pandemic that kept us all indoors and on Zoom throughout the entire school year. It was produced like the previous edition, so all the classes during the meetings were by Zoom. All the interviews by the authors were done on Zoom, and the class research trip, which we used to really enjoy, because this was a chance for the students to interview experts on their topic face to face. That trip, unfortunately, had to be canceled due to the pandemic. So there were no happy hour drinks and kushiyaki at Gonpachi in Tokyo this year. This put a lot of onus on the students to do their basic research, first looking at printed sources and then seeking out experts, academics, officials, researchers at think tanks, etc. In the United States and even in Japan. The interviews, of course, were mostly virtual, and this part of the research process, I am pleased to say the students did an amazing job. Congratulations to all. And my job this year is over, but there is one more thing to do, and I would like to publicize not only with this rollout, but also by publicizing these papers, which are available, as I mentioned, in a PDF form on the SAIS Research, the Reischauer Center site. All of our yearbooks are available back to 2009, as a matter of fact. I would like to just show you a picture of, you can see it, the coming hard copy version, and I did the picture on the front. These books have been changing over the years. Originally, if you take a look at this one from 2008, it was basically just a summary of what the year was all about, and then it became more topical, and finally now it's the research focuses on some overarching themes in each year. The overarching themes, of course, this year in our publication, the legacy of Abe Shinzo, the longest serving prime minister who resigned in late 2020. Another theme, Japan's changing defense policy in reaction to increased security tensions in the region, the historical memory issue, minority groups in Japan, and foreigners, immigrants in Japan. There was a paper on climate change, which will be also addressed in today's panel, and a paper on cultural diplomacy, a full set of wonderful papers to give you an in-depth and insightful look at Japan changing over not only the last year, but in recent years. Now, let me turn to the first panel, which I will introduce. And then Dr. Fumiko Sasaki, who teaches at Columbia University, my old alma mater, will MC the second panel. First up at bat is Joe Bauer, who took up as his topic the daunting task of assessing the legacy of Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, focusing on his diplomacy and even more precisely his, quote, bromance, unquote, his bromance-like relationship with Donald J. Trump. His paper was enjoyable reading and very insightful for me. Joe, tell us about your paper and the conclusions you reached in it.
Thank you, Professor Brooks, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the Reischauer Center for putting this event together. I can share my PowerPoint here now. As the title suggests, I looked at Prime Minister Abe's relationship and attempts to sort of court President Donald Trump for Japan's benefit and gain. Obviously, no easy task, and whether or not Prime Minister Abe was successful in this endeavor. To begin things, oops, there we go. I looked back at a bit of a historical precedent of previous Japanese prime ministers and their relationships with US presidents. Some ones that stood out were Prime Minister Nakasone and President Reagan in the 1980s, the so-called Ran-Yasu relationship, as the two were on a first-name basis. And more recently, Prime Minister Koizumi and President Bush in the early 2000s. Now, these are obviously the exception rather than the norm, as in recent decades, we've seen a bit more of a revolving door of Japanese prime ministers. President Clinton, for instance, in the late 1990s, had 7 different Japanese prime ministers during his 8 years in office. So as you can imagine, it's a bit more difficult to build sort of that personal relationship in such a short amount of time. Going back to Prime Minister Abe, when he first came back into office in 2012, he was obviously paired with President Barack Obama, and the two did get off to a bit of a rough start, particularly following Prime Minister Abe's decision to visit Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. However, the two were able to kind of set their differences aside and find a pragmatic way to build the relationship together. And I think this was particularly highlighted in 2016 when President Obama gave a speech in Hiroshima and Prime Minister Abe in turn gave one at Pearl Harbor. Following President Obama's the end of his term in office, there was high expectations that Secretary Clinton would likely win the US presidential election and follow a roughly similar sort of Japan Indo-Pacific policy as President Obama. However, Donald Trump's surprise victory, I think, set off kind of shockwaves internationally, and particularly in Tokyo, given candidate Trump's sort of rhetoric on Japan during the campaign and in previous decades, whether it was on issues of security or issues of trade and economics. Abe, not wanting to be caught flat-footed, went to full drive right away, visiting President-elect Trump at Trump Tower in New York and gifting him with a gold-coated golf club. I think this set sort of an early precedent on how the relationship would go and the lengths to which Prime Minister Abe was willing to go to sort of build the friendship and kind of build that personal relationship that was needed. Looking at some of the key issues, the first would be North Korea, an issue Abe had a lot of familiarity with dating back to the 1990s as an early member of the Diet and focusing on issues such as the Japanese abductee issue. Prime Minister Abe in Trump's early days was one of the top international advisors he had, quite often in his ear and urging the maximum pressure campaign. And Trump in turn was often quick to call Abe after North Korean missile or weapons test, often within hours of the event, where other global leaders, such as even South Korean President Moon Jae-in, sometimes didn't hear until even the next day. I think in this area, Abe had a good amount of early success. Trump obviously pushed quite hard with the maximum pressure campaign. There was rhetoric such as the little rocket man. However, in Trump fashion, this soon shifted, and he instead searched for more of a leader-to-leader relationship, resulting in the Singapore and later Hanoi summits. Obviously, neither of these summits brought much direct results. However, I think it did set the US administration to a bit of a lull on North Korea policy, hoping to keep the door open for further progress, and as well shifting away attention to more of the US-China competition and the ongoing trade war. On the topic of trade, that was another area where during the election cycle, President Trump or candidate Trump was much more tough on Japan, saying they're ripping us off, selling us all these cars, not buying anything. And I think that was an area where Abe obviously had lots of concern, especially as tariffs started being levied against other countries, given Japan's reliance on the US as an export market. Here, I think, is a key area where Abe's relationship with Trump came in handy. He was able to use the friendship to kind of get President Trump to kick that can down the road, waiting longer for an actual deal to be signed on new trade relations, particularly waiting until after the summer election so Abe and the LDP could secure a new victory, as well as kind of easing up on the trade things, I think, especially going into the next election in 2020, where Trump wanted campaign victories to be able to tout ahead of a re-election campaign. Other areas I did look at as well were China and Iran. Those were areas I don't think that Abe had as much success as he would have hoped. There's a lot of high hopes, for instance, in China and kind of building up those relations. But once COVID hit, those sort of took a back burner seat as well, with domestic priorities taking precedent. On the broader question of was Abe's diplomacy successful, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. As you can see here, early on in the early years, there was much more of a direct dialogue between the two, and it tapered off in 2020. Again, I think that is in large part due to domestic concerns with the COVID-19 pandemic. But in general, I think it's not necessarily the major benefits and victories that Abe was able to pull out, but rather keeping the relationship afloat. Going in with Trump's rhetoric, I think there was a lot of concern in Tokyo and around the globe as to how US-Japan relations might play out. But Abe, kind of courting President Trump, bringing him to Tokyo, playing golf, going to sumo tournaments, was able to find a middle ground and sort of keep Trump on his side, something that I think other world leaders such as Emmanuel Macron attempted, but sort of faltered with and gave up on over time. Professor Brooks, I think you gave Prime Minister Abe a B+ rating in the intro to this year's yearbook. And I think that's the appropriate grade. Again, there wasn't major necessary victories that Abe can point to, but it was more the benefits of keeping the relationship together, building ties, and kind of continuing precedent that had set in recent years. Looking forward, what is the future for this? When I was writing this paper last spring, obviously Prime Minister Suga was in office, and many correctly predicted that he was more of a placeholder rather than a long-term solution to Japan's political issues. Now that Prime Minister Kishida is in office, he has met with President Biden once in person, and there are talks to have another in-person meeting between the pair before year's end. So I think there's a strong possibility that the two can kind of build that relationship. But I think, again, the big question is, how long can Prime Minister Kishida stay in office? Will he be able to sort of follow Abe and have multi-years in office? Or will we go back to one of those eras where sort of every year we're seeing a new prime minister? And if that is the case, I think there are still candidates in waiting who have the potential to build these relationships with the US counterparts. Two pictured here, Konotaro and Koizumi Shinjiro are two amongst many who have previous relationships with and in the US, and I think have the possibility. But I think there, again, the million-dollar question is, how long will they be able to stay in office? So in closing, I think on the question of was Abe successful, I think yes. I don't think he necessarily got all the gains he wanted to. However, had Abe not put in the efforts to befriend President Trump, or had other Japanese politicians been in the position of prime minister, I likely think we wouldn't have seen the same results as we did under Prime Minister Abe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe. I was taking lots of notes while you were explaining it. Very, very nice job. I think you really have captured the magic that occurred between Trump and Abe. Their personal ties, I think, probably were not necessarily sincere, but manipulative. So maybe if I could ask you a general question, what were the secrets or the secret that Abe had to be able to really play Trump sometimes like a fiddle? It didn't always work, but certainly it was a success. And is there any area in particular where the U.S. and Japan did not benefit from that bromance, that relationship?
Sure. I think in question of what was Abe able to do, I think he was very much able to play to Trump's kind of desire for grandeur and kind of pomp at different events. Obviously, the pair went golfing almost on every occasion they were together. There was photos of Prime Minister Abe and President Trump eating cheeseburgers in Japan with their Make Alliance Stronger hats. Prime Minister Abe bringing President Trump to a sumo tournament and having present the President's Cup trophy, a special trophy like that. So sort of playing to the president's ego and being willing to, have a meeting with President Trump, and then the next week, President Trump sending a tweet about Japan that might be negative, and whereas other world leaders might have been turned off by that and said, what's the point of trying at this? Prime Minister Abe was still much more willing to kind of let it slide and kind of keep building on that relationship moving forward. In terms of where there was some faltering, I think just in general ties, as I mentioned, for instance, at the end of President Obama's time in office, we saw the dual speeches, as I mentioned, in Hiroshima and Pearl Harbor. And I don't think we really sort of saw that same familiarity in terms of people-to-people ties and sort of building stronger bonds. Oftentimes it seemed as though Japan was sort of playing second fiddle to what President Trump's policy ideas were, and it wasn't so much a level playing field, which I think was starting to build more so under President Obama. So I think Abe certainly would have liked to have played a bigger role in influencing Trump. And I think early on, for instance, with North Korea, as I mentioned, he did sort of have that role. But as time went on, it was sort of more sort of what President Trump wants to do, President Trump will do, and Abe kind of has to take the back seat.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. Yes. My second question is sort of a follow-up question. Since you wrote the paper, a lot of things have happened. If you had to write something additional to your paper, a kind of postscript, what would you say now?
Well, as I mentioned, when I was writing the paper, Prime Minister Suga was in office. And at the time, again, he was kind of seen more as a placeholder rather than as a long-term solution. And so it wasn't necessarily so surprising that he only lasted less than 1 year in office. And now we have Prime Minister Kishida. So I think it's hard to change the initial conclusions I had in the original paper, that it's sort of a wait and see thing, and it'll be more how domestic Japanese politics play out. And if anyone within the LDP or unlikely in another party can kind of gain that majority and kind of keep hold on power. Prime Minister Abe still clearly has a quite influential voice within the LDP. So it'll be interesting to see if he kind of grooms anyone to sort of take on that role. But I think it's more of a wait and see, and we'll have to see if anyone within Japanese politics kind of masters Abe's art of staying in power for more than just a single year term.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if there are any others out there who would like to ask a question from our participants. We have a couple of more minutes.
Actually, if I can add, I know that you discussed, what do you think of the Obama-Abe administration in that relationship? Do you think it was more effective than the Trump-Abe relationship, or just different?
Sure. I think it was certainly different in terms of that President Obama was much more of a traditional leader in terms of US presidents than President Trump. As I mentioned, things did get off to a bit of a rocky start. Prime Minister's visit to Yasukuni was openly condemned by the Obama administration, the embassy in Tokyo. And so I think there was some hard feelings early on, though Prime Minister Abe was sort of able to put aside some of those nationalist urges maybe and find sort of the common ground to working with the US and working with President Obama. And I think this also sort of came at a time when the Obama administration was beginning to take more of a tough stance, for instance, on China. And I think that particularly also helped Abe's quest for sort of enhancing Japan's security. So I think I think it falls more similar to a traditional US-Japan relationship under Obama. And I think both kind of saw the pragmatic value in having the US and Japan work together cooperatively rather than kind of butting heads was much more beneficial. Whereas again, under President Trump, I think it was more Abe oftentimes seemed as though he was being dragged along rather than kind of playing the level head of state.
Thank you. I see there's a comment from Dave Shear, and I'll read part of it. When Abe's meeting with Trump during the transition was highly unusual, if not unprecedented, and it demonstrated Abe's boldness or desperation. Heads of government just don't meet with presidents elect out of respect for the outgoing president. Not surprisingly, Abe's move deeply irritated the Obama White House. So it didn't start off necessarily on the right foot, but certainly it played to the Trump audience quite well.
Yeah, and I certainly agree. I think it is a kind of a mix of boldness and almost desperation. As I mentioned on the campaign trail, candidate Trump, Japan was one of the countries he beat up on the most, and it's something going back to even The Art of the Deal, his books back in the day, routinely criticized Japan's trade practices. So I think Abe quickly kind of came to the conclusion that if President Trump does come into office, we need to make sure we're on good terms. And I think that was obviously quite easily reflected with gifting him a gold-plated golf club.
Thank you very much, Joe. Excellent, outstanding presentation. And I highly urge everybody to run over to the SAIS website later on and read your paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, we're turning next to our second panelist. Actually, we would have liked to have with us today Stephanie Mafrici, who wrote an excellent paper on the changing role of the Marines in the region, including Okinawa. Stephanie is an active Marine officer who served in Okinawa, but unfortunately she could not make it today. So you'll all have to read that paper on the SAIS RC website as well. But we are fortunate to have the author here today of a companion piece on US-Japan security issues written by Kojiro Tonosaki, an officer in Japan's ground self-defense force who is now no longer at SAIS, but at CSIS. So he's still in town if you want to contact him. Tonosaki-san's paper actually told me things that I just didn't know about the region at that time. It focuses mostly on China's new maritime security law and shows very in a fascinating way with case studies how China is drastically changing the security status quo in the region. It's an eye-opener, and I highly recommend reading that paper as well. Tonosaki-san, tell us why the US and Japan should now be getting even more worried by China's marine activities. The podium is yours.
Thank you for introducing me, Dr. Brooks. And one thing I have to correct, I'm a Japan Air Self-Defense Force, not Ground Self-Defense Force. So yeah, but yeah, thank you for welcoming me. And I will talk about the Chinese Coast Guard law, the impact of the law on Japan-United States alliance. But these slides and my views here do not constitute any official position towards China and Chinese Coast Guard law. Also, it is not related to my country's policies and my organization. So in this presentation, I will mention three things: research question, argument, and my conclusion. What is the Chinese Coast Guard law? What is the impact on us? These are my research questions. As you know, this April, former Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga visited the United States. This is absolutely kind of big event. For the first time, 52 years, a joint statement clearly states the word Taiwan. From a security perspective, it was a very meaningful meeting. But what is the background to this? In my opinion, it is a big geopolitical factor, rising of China. Japan, the United States, and other countries are puzzled, and they are worried of China's extreme claims of maritime interests. Chinese Coast Guard law is a catalyst for strengthening the alliance because the active behaviors of the Chinese Coast Guard since February 1st have heightened Japan's alarm. And it is inconsistent with the freedom of navigation by international law. This is my argument. In Japan, discussion on Chinese Coast Guard law are often told only in the context of Senkaku Island in the East China Sea. But I believe that is not enough. This is because the Senkaku Islands are not the only area where China applied this law. I think it is necessary to think about how it will affect Japan-United States relations and think specifically about what should be done based on the view that it is a security issue in the East Asia region. Regarding the Coast Guard law of the People's Republic of China, I have analyzed that the 3 points should be taken note. First, some international commentators have described the China Coast Guard as paramilitary, but the law stipulates actually that the CCG is equally the country's armed forces. Second, Article 22 of the law lays out the use of weapons to foreign organizations or individuals in the seas. In addition, because Article 21 stipulates that forcible eviction may be taken against illegal acts committed by foreign military vessels. If the CCG decides they need to do so, they can use weapons. Third, China's claims to these jurisdictional waters are considerably different from maritime claims made by Japan, the United States, and other countries, and the ambiguous definition challenges the foundation of international law. In my research paper, I focused on 2 cases that have occurred in the past. There have been several cases and collisions between China and other countries in East Asia over the past decades. First, I'd like to introduce examples of China's diplomatic success. On April 10, 2012, a Philippine warship intercepted several Chinese fishermen at the disputed Scarborough Shoal, leading to a 2-month standoff when 2 Chinese law enforcement vessels arrived before Manila could complete the arrest. Despite initial de-escalations, the 2 sides could not agree on the terms of a total withdrawal. On April 30, the United States offered support for its treaty ally, but chose not to intervene directly. Facing increasing pressure, the Philippine president empowered a backdoor negotiator to work with Beijing. However, on June 15th, Philippines vessels left the shore while China either returned and began denying entry to Philippine fishermen, resulting in a de facto seizure of control by Beijing. In this slide, I will explain the setting of the East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone, which is EDIS by China. On November 23rd, 2013, Beijing announced its first air defense identification zone to better monitor and control international airspace in much of East China Sea. The United States, Japan, and other regional states quickly criticized the decision, particularly for its perceived coercive intents, inclusion of airspace above disputed territory, overlap with the existing eddies of other states, and threats of emergency defensive measures against non-compliance. United States criticism also focused on a lack of prior consultation although Beijing did inform at least some officials in Seoul and Tokyo ahead of time. Due to the announcement and concerns about its enforcement, the United States, Japan, and South Korea all deployed military aircraft to transit China's East China Sea edges without prior submission of flight plans to China. Facing strong criticism, Beijing seemed to backpedal diplomatically. It also appeared to exhibit difficulty in effectively monitoring its existing zone. I recognize the case as a case of China's diplomatic failure. From these two cases, I am thinking of deriving some implications. In 2013, Abes case, China has substantially withdrawn its claim. On the other hand, in the case of Scarborough Reef in 2012, China de facto controls Scarborough Reef to the present day. What will it happen in the case of 2021? I think China's Coast Guard laws have raised the alarm in Japan, the United States, and East Asian countries. In addition, it is clear that the alliance is moving towards strengthening, as seen in the recent Japan-United States, Suga and Biden talk. In the first case, reaction of the United States, the Philippines, and Japan were different. China was let off the hook. In the second case, international opinion centered on the robust United States response was swift and decisive. China quietly backed down. This pattern of response suggests how China's changes to CCG law might be approached by the United States and Japan. Based on the lessons learned from these incidents, what can be done to enhance regional security and ensure stability and prosperity in East Asia? My key takeaways are here. First, strengthen the bilateral alliance. Because to deter China's excessive behavior, the United States must show a strong commitment from the beginning, with close communication with its allies such as Japan, Korea, and Philippines. The alliance can only work as a deterrent if both countries are firmly committed from the start in case of an incident like this. Second, increase the number of like-minded countries, because it is important to communicate and cooperate on a daily basis with countries that share values and interests. Increasing the number of like-minded countries makes it easier to respond to a common threat. Third, provide assistance to build maritime and air surveillance capability of relevant countries in the region. Because in order to make an appropriate decision, it is essential to be accurately aware of the situation and calculate what the other is likely or is able to do. In addition, support to build maritime security and air surveillance capacities of related countries, in this case, in Southeast Asia, is essential. This is the end of my presentation. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tonosaki-san, and I apologize for messing up your organization. I should have known, being a veteran of the U.S. Air Force, that you were in the Air Force. Your presentation was also high flying and in the stratosphere. So thank you so much. I do have a couple of simple questions. Your paper, it's very persuasive about what the new law means and how the U.S. and Japan and the international community might respond. But in specific terms, what do you think China might do next to implement this new law? Do you anticipate possibly a collision or a conflict, or do you think that deterrence will hold?
Yeah, so I think many defense commentators and many defense practitioners in the Japan and the United States worried about the China may invade the Taiwan or something. But I think it's we can't estimate correctly, right? Some are Indo-PACOM commander testified March within the 6 years, but I think nobody knows China's next actions. So, but I think the law is kind of the preparation for the next action. Like so now the real war fighting is difficult to be executed because many new domains are coming now. So like our cyber domain and space domain, and also like it is difficult to execute to the real war fighting. So I think just we should communicate each other, like 2 weeks ago, Biden and Xi Jinping make a telephone call, and they share their views and make some ideas. And I think they may form the new committee to communicate each other, like in domains of the economy and the security, I think. So we should keep continue to communicate. The misunderstanding is a very very dangerous situation, I think. So this is my opinion, sir.
Yeah, I agree. But it is concerning because your paper focuses on changing the status quo, but just like with the South China Sea, there's now a new status quo.
Right.
And China perhaps will incrementally change that status quo, inching up.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Since you wrote your paper, have there been any new developments either with that law or in other areas? I mean, you talked about the Taiwan issue, obviously. Yeah,
obviously, yeah. So this is after I graduated this May, many things were happened. Like in August, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and in September, the United States surprisingly announced the AUKUS was formed with the Australia, United States, and England, even though the invoking the French anger. And so I think this feel like regarding about this law, not so there is no big change about but if I can add any comments on my paper. I'd like to analyze why AUKUS was formed suddenly. I think it's the specific security cooperation about nuclear submarine techniques. So I think Australia worry of the China's maritime power, I think. So that is why they denied the French submarine, conventional submarine. So I would like to examine why the AUKUS is now. So this is something interesting.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to your next paper then at SAIS.
I have time, so thanks so much.
Yeah, I think we have time maybe for one question. Does anybody have a question from the audience? I see no hands are raised. Again, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Very perceptive, and looking forward to getting together with you over coffee again sometimes.
Yeah.
Okay, take care.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye. Well, with Tonosaki's presentation, my panel's job is done. I would say that the presentation, the two that we had, are extremely persuasive. Joe Bauer's presentation gave me a little confidence that the future political scene in Tokyo may be influenced by another pragmatic yet very, very bold and clever prime minister who can keep the relationship on track even during rough times, and sometimes we need that. And Tonosaki's presentation again shows both the perception, the strong perception in Japan of rising China and the problems that exist, but at the same time, there really aren't any easy or quick fixes to the problems as the status quo is changed, and it seems that one side raises the other, and then the other side raises the other, and we escalate slowly and surely. So whether the solution will be more diplomacy and more a close consultation, or whether it will be eventually a Graham-Allison confrontation, that remains to be seen, and subject of a future yearbook in the years to come. With that, I'd like to turn over the speaker's podium to Monica, who will introduce Dr. Sasaki. Thank you.
Thank you very much again, Dr. Brooks. Dr. Fumiko, the moderator for our second panel, she was kind enough to offer her time for our students today, and we're very grateful to have her here. So Dr. Fumiko Sasaki is currently a visiting scholar at the Reischauer Center School of Advanced International Studies. So her current research with us focuses on US-Japan competition in space, specifically focusing on satellites. And so at Johns Hopkins University, she earned her PhD. She teaches East Asian security for the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia University, and has also taught at various courses at graduate schools, including Columbia University at the Earth Institute as well. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over the podium to Dr. Sasaki. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me today, and I'm delighted to be a moderator of this panel discussion. So first, this second panel is focused on social and environmental issues, and importantly, the issues the three panelists are going to talk about are very kind of the minor issues. Minor means not well discussed in Japan. So I'm very pleased to have these educational and very detailed presentations. So let me start with summarizing the contributions and significance of these three papers and the researches. So they have three aspects in common, which I believe that SAIS is focused on as learning objectives for the study here. So first, all of them applied the theories in analyzing the issues, even if it is not directly mentioned. Second, the all issues generated by globalization. The third is that they remind us of the importance of strategic solutions. So let me briefly explain one by one. So first, all three papers are focused on the decision-making processes. And in setting the goals, all of the three apply the rational actor model. That is, if Japan is a rational actor, what should be the goals? In analyzing their issues, Vivian and Emma used the organizational process model by focusing on the ministries in charge of these issues. Monica's approach is based on the governmental politics model by focusing on the critical actors rather than organizational competitions. Secondly, these issues are all generated and promoted by globalization, immigration, climate change, and increasing attention to identity politics. Third, all these issues need strategic solutions. Why? Because these issues are all about minorities, immigrants in Japan, ethnic minorities in Japan, and environmental issues that actually not many Japanese people prioritize in their lives. So that means that all these issues are very difficult to solve. Why? Because these issues do not engage the majority. Politicians tend to do what, not so much what is right, but what secure the votes for them. That means that we need a strategic approach in incentivizing the majorities to support the minority. So in this way, these issues are very difficult, but all three panelists tackled these issues. And I was very impressed by these thorough examinations of these issues. So let me start with the first presenter, Vivian Chen. Her presentation title is Integration of Immigrant Children in Japanese Schools. Vivian, okay, good. Vivian is a second-year master's student concentrating in Japan studies. She currently serves as a communication intern at Sasakawa, USA. Please start, Vivian.
Thank you so much, Sasaki Sensei, for the kind introduction. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to share my screen. My apologies. It's coming up soon. Okay, thank you so much for your patience. And I also want to thank the Reischauer Center for giving me the opportunity to share research I conducted last spring in Dr. Brooks's class. So my topic is more of a niche area of focus, like Sasaki Sensei mentioned. I'm going to be looking at the integration of immigrant children in Japanese schools. And the reason I chose this topic was actually I was a teacher in Japan through the JET program, which employs foreign English teachers to teach throughout the country. And it was there that I first intimately got to meet with students who were not of the typical Japanese background. Either one or both of their parents were foreign. And it was through hearing their stories, I got interested in doing research about what challenges they faced in the Japanese education system and how they wish things could be different to help them feel like they could fit more into to the school system. So for my research, my argument focuses on the future of Japan's growth and productivity and sustainability as well. I believe that there should be substantial policy reforms required to establish a more concrete and inclusive education system, especially for immigrant students. There needs to be a greater amount of diversified support and resources like language training and multicultural immersion to students from different backgrounds. And with Japan's burgeoning aging population and dwindling youth population, it is a reality that this country must turn towards building a concrete and established immigration policy. While the Japanese government has made progress in creating a more inclusive education system through the recent passing of laws that strengthen and support immigrant students, I believe that another point of reference that Japan may be able to obtain valuable lessons from is the United States education system methods for incorporating immigrant and refugee children into schools. The United States has had a long history of welcoming foreign children into both its public and private education system since the late 1800s. And while there is no doubt that the US still has its own challenges in reforming its schools, I believe there are still some successful public policies and practices that Japan could take away from their ally in helping reform its predominantly centralized and homogeneous education system for the better. So first, a little bit about a background about the Japanese education system. Like many people may be aware, Japan is a heavily aging population. 1 in every 4 people is over the age of 65. The birth rate in Japan is 1.368, which is one of the lowest in the world and has led to a shrinking youth population. This has not been surprising due to this decrease in population, that the number of schools and students in Japan has fallen in recent years. More than 200 schools closed in Japan in 2019, and a survey conducted by Japan's Ministry of Education found that in 2019, there was a year-on-year decrease of 154 elementary schools and 48 junior high schools. So in the long term, 19,738 elementary schools and 10,222 junior high schools dropped by over 50% beginning in the late 1940s to 1950s. And yet, on the other hand, while the overall number of students in Japanese schools is declining, the percentage of those that need further support in Japanese instruction is rising rapidly, which can be attributed to the increase in foreign children studying at Japanese schools. As of 2016, there were more than 43,000 students in Japanese public primary and lower secondary schools who were deemed to be in need of Japanese language instruction. And this number has risen dramatically, a 60% jump since 2006, as demonstrated by the figures here of those who do not have Japanese nationality, but do need support in schools. And while Japan does have a background of welcoming minority students, whether it be Zainichi Koreans from Japan's former colonization of Korea to Chinese returnees, Indo-Chinese returnees, immigrant children are still a minor issue in Japanese society. Recently, there have been amendments to the Immigration Control Refugee Recognition Act in 1990, and also the introduction of a new visa program in 2019, which further contributed to the rise of immigrants, families and their children in Japanese society. And these amendments specifically allow Nikkeijin, Japanese descendants up to the third generation, to reside and work in Japan without any restrictions with a special long-term resident status. But despite that, these visas are only for the short term, up to 5 years. Also looking at the general population of foreign residents, it has reached an all-time high of 2.8 million in 2019, equating to about 2% of the total population. Yet the Japanese government does not use the term immigrant when describing the foreign population in Japan, and currently does not have a comprehensive social integration policy, despite many immigrants making Japan their permanent home and building communities there too. There's also been an increase of 25% immigrant children and youth in Japan in the last 10 years. In Tokyo, 1 in 8 new adults who turned 20 in 2017 have a foreign background. So what exactly are the issues that face foreign students? Those include, constitutionally, they're not obligated actually to attend school. If foreign parents or guardians want their children to go to Japanese public schools, they need to obtain permission from the local school boards, and data shows that almost 40% of local governments do not tell foreigners how to enroll their children in school. And even if they do, some of these municipalities, they send notices only in Japanese, which is sometimes a written barrier for many immigrants and their children. Also, there is another disparity as well. For example, 98% of students in Japan who continue to senior high schools, they're ethnically Japanese, the traditional background, but among immigrant students, that figure is significantly lower, down to 11% to 60%, depending on the student's nationality. The other issue facing immigrant students in Japanese schools is the focus of promoting monolingualism. So Japanese schools encourage immigrant students to adapt to the local setting, and they tend to treat their mother tongues as more of a hindrance as opposed to an asset in the classroom. That is influenced in the textbook and other ways of teaching for these students. Japanese schools don't really give minority students a chance to learn their native languages within the framework of the official curriculum. And the pressure to conform can also be a negative impact on students. And the Japanese government has made some measures. They've had opportunities to increase enrollment and attendance, whether it be introducing alternative school arrangements such as night schools, or adaptable arrangements such as schools accepting students of any age. The Japan Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology has also introduced several measures to assist students with limited Japanese proficiency. Some of them offer special language programs or hold workshops for teachers on this subject. And also municipal boards of education have hired full and part-time Japanese language teachers. However, as the last bullet point indicates, this distribution of these services has been uneven and localized heavily. So in my research, I did take a look at how this distribution of services is very unequal. I won't delve into it very deeply, but looking at the prefecture I worked in, Shimane, a large city like Izumo, which has over 175,000 residents, had many multilingual support systems and services offered to residents, as opposed to Tsuwana, which is a very small village that did not really have any services for immigrant students and their families. So through my research, I'm looking at how US education policy might serve as a reference for Japanese schools to help integrate immigrant students. And there's quite a variety of programs that could be implemented, such as English language acquisition programs, having states, or I should say prefectures, set up mandatory percentage or quotas to reach for educational funds dedicated to helping immigrant students through various programs and services. Other options include the proliferation of bilingual education schools, not just helping immigrant students, but also native Japanese students to learn about new cultures and other languages as well. And to sum everything up, I believe that there is a need for greater bilingual educational support and resources for immigrant students in Japan, such as through the establishment of bilingual preschools or extracurricular classes that could help immigrant students adapt more easily to the classroom. Also from the government side, to providing incentives or even scholarships to teachers to study how to teach Japanese as a second language is another proposed solution. And also just improving the overall condition of teaching conditions of Japanese teachers to give them more time to study and learn from alternative programs as well too. So I think if Japan wants to be seen as a good option for foreign workers and their families in the long term, it needs to communicate and establish that it has the proper structure in place to welcome beginning in Japanese classrooms. While Japan's skyrocketing aging population and shrinking youth population is continuing, I think Japan needs to sooner, not later, confront the need for building a concrete and established immigration policy, beginning with education. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. That was really thorough research, and also spotlight issues which most of the Japanese people really do not pay attention. So I'm very pleased that you did it. So I want to ask a couple of questions, which is more like a big picture of this surrounding this issue. So first, unfortunately, these issues are relatively minorities, right? So it's not a big voice in Japan. There's no big voice to support it in Japan. What do you think is the way to mobilize the majorities to think that this issue is very important and solving this issue is actually good for the majority of Japanese people? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very good question, Sasaki sensei. I think it's still very tough to talk about immigration in Japan. I think according to at least the most public opinion polls recently, people are still very opposed to the idea of welcoming foreigners into the country long-term. But I think even 2 weeks ago, Chief Cabinet Secretary Matsuno, he mentioned potentially even revising this policy to allow formerly foreign workers who could stay only 5 years up to indefinite residence in Japan. So the labor shortage is real, and I think Japan has to come face with that reality sooner than later. I think it'd be also good to frame it as an issue that benefits Japan, native Japanese people as well too. Having their students be exposed to different cultures, languages at a younger age, I think for the future generations of Japan, and also sustainability as a world power globally as well too. I think it'd be, the right direction to head. I just don't know if we're there yet. I think it's an issue that is a non-starter in the LDP right now, but I think as the population and demographic crisis grows, it's going to be increasingly on the table.
Thank you. That's really, I totally agree with you that how to frame it, this issue, not as a minority issue, but for the majority, right? Japanese people as a whole.
Right.
Thank you. And a little bit of the question that I do not know well about the details. So do you know what kind of people, or who's the main advocate of this issue? If you know some politicians or national level or local level, who is maybe the person to go to talk about this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Something I would like to explore more if I had more time in my research. I would say that the majority of Japanese politicians just tend to not talk about it or be a proponent because it's not something the Japanese public favors right now. But I have seen trends where more of the opposition parties, such as the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan over the LDP, Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, have been more open to the idea of instituting an actual immigration policy to the country. So,
thank you. I also agree that not many people, like politicians, try to get engaged in this issue because, as you said, the people are not that interested in. Okay, thank you. Anyone who have some question? Yeah, question that I think that I can pick up a couple of questions. Okay, then I will move on to the second panelist. Thank you, Vivian. Thank you. Okay, thank you. I will now invite Emma. So, hi, Emma. So the presentation title is Japan's Green Economic Recovery from COVID-19. Emma is a renewable energy associate at Atlas Renewable Power. She completed her master's degree at SAIS this spring, where she concentrated on energy, resources, and the environment. So please, Emma, start.
Great, thank you so much, Sasaki-sensei, for that introduction. Let me just share my screen. Let me know if you're able to see it.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great.
I think that it's a little bit smaller, so I think that we are seeing half of it. Do you think that the board? Yeah, okay. I think that that is good. Yeah, thank you. I will tell you if it doesn't work well. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you. All right, so so my paper topic was on Japan's green recovery from COVID-19, which unfortunately is still a relevant topic as we're entering the next wave of the pandemic. But I'm gonna just go ahead and start with a bit of background and then get into kind of the methods of my paper and then some of the key findings before I close. So first, just a little background on Japan's current energy mix. Japan is still heavily reliant on coal for its energy, and in 2019, fossil fuels accounted for about 88% of the total primary energy supply. Before 2011, over 25% of Japan's energy was generated through nuclear power, but the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident resulted in the immediate closure of almost all operating nuclear reactors in the country. And this completely reconfigured the energy fuel mix, replacing nuclear sources mainly with coal, oil, and other fossil fuels. And Japan is now the world's largest importer of LNG, importing over 75% of its total energy. And just a little bit of background on Japan's electricity sector. Originally, Japanese utilities were entirely state-owned before the creation of 10 major regional companies after World War II. And while recently there have been major decentralizing efforts, the high price of electricity are largely attributed to a lack of competition among these main companies. And after new policies were put into place, the Organization for Cross-Regional Coordination of Transmission Operators, OCCTO, was established in 2015 to oversee the country's electric grid. This is from 2019. It just shows kind of the CO2 emissions by sector in Japan. And as you can see, the industrial sector makes up or accounts for about 35% of the emissions, followed by transportation and business. And 5% of the transportation is just private cars alone. And the total emissions amount to about over 1,100 million tons of CO2. And within the industrial sector, the steel industry is the most CO2 intensive at about 40% of the industrial sector. So in my research, I found a kind of interesting study that identified a unique policy process that factors into Japan's national climate change agenda that includes public opinion, bureaucratized decision-making, namely in the METI-MOU rivalry, and METI is the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, and a balance of power among interest groups that favor heavy industry. On the right side of this slide are just a list of some the key clean energy policies that Japan has implemented, and I'll talk about the first two more on the next slide, but overall, the renewable portfolio standards that were introduced in 2003 that required renewables to make up a certain amount of energy generation were not seen as very effective, and now there currently aren't. There isn't an RPS in Japan. But in 2020, a feed-in premium system was announced that will be introduced soon next year on top of the FIT scheme. And auctions have now been introduced since 2019 and have emerged as one of the central policy tools facilitating the national transition to renewables. And by 2025, solar PV auctions have been completed that have helped drive down the price of solar PV, that's solar photovoltaic. But solar PV prices remain much higher in Japan than in comparable economies. So here you can kind of see the effect, the impact of some of Japan's clean energy policies. So solar PV deployment accelerated after the feed-in tariff or FIT system in 2012, more than any other renewable technology. So there's really no disputing the success of the FIT system in increasing renewables in Japan's energy mix. Speaking to the interviewees in my research, while the FIT system was critical in renewable energy adoption, there were still lots of flaws in the FIT system. First, the tariff was much too high for the first 2 to 3 years, was one kind of feedback I heard a lot, and that the scheme was just ended up being ultimately fiscally unsustainable. And eventually a price adjustment was put into place. But there were calls to kind of maybe more lessons to be taken from the German system prior to facing these challenges. And there weren't sufficient environmental regulations in place. So many habitats were kind of destroyed in building some of the commercial solar plants. A lot of people ask, why not geothermal? There are lots of kind of non-technical obstacles for building geothermal in Japan. And you can kind of see here that geothermal makes up less than 1% of renewable energy generation. And that's largely, despite all the natural resources, and that's largely due to the onsen or hot spring owners' concern over the depletion of the available hot water. And in fact, the majority of the resources are located in national parks that are just heavily regulated. In 2018, the utilization of sea areas and development of power generation facilities using maritime renewable energy resources, that's all one title, but allows wind projects to occupy the sea areas for 30 years, which is really helpful for developers because the FIT system lasts up to 20 years. And it's currently, they're mostly in the Tohoku area, and wind projects have higher upfront costs and take a longer time to implement, which is why we don't see as much growth in that particular renewable energy source here as compared to solar PV. There's just a lot of red tape on wind projects, and environmental assessments can take as long as 4 years to complete. So this is kind of just a breakdown of the types of people I interviewed for this paper. So we had people in government, academia, in the actual energy sector, and in kind of international organizations. I use this kind of political theoretical framework as a way to look at Japan's green economic recovery. A recent paper drew on American political scientist John Kingdon's theory of policy windows to examine environmental policy making specifically. And this conceptual outline argues that there are 3 process streams: problem, policies, and politics, that interact to create policy windows that allow the uptake of knowledge and information to be translated into substantive policy creation and implementation. So the COVID-19 crisis identified as the problem, along with the lowering costs of renewable energies due to those policies I'd mentioned, and then a change in the administration, the politics, has the potential to generate a window of opportunity for Japan to reinvigorate its climate action policies and take a leading role in the region on the fight against climate change. Yeah, it's also notable that a lot of those renewable energy policies previously mentioned, like the initial FIT system of 2009, and then again in 2012, came after national problems like the Great Recession and the 2011 earthquake. So there's kind of a precedent for viewing this framework. It's a helpful framework to use. So yeah, in the context of COVID-19, there's a lot of potential for green economic recovery. Green recovery plans have been initiated around the world with the European Union's nearly $900 billion commitment to climate action through the Next Generation EU and Just Transition Fund. The Republic of Korea has plans to invest $62 million into the Digital and Green New Deal, focusing on green job creation, renewable energy investment, and energy efficiency. And according to the Federal Statistical Data and the Statistics Bureau of Japan, unemployment shocks have hit the US much harder in the initial onset of the pandemic, while Japan has been able to reduce rates during the COVID-19 crisis, but the situation is kind of ever changing. According to the Green Stimulus Index, this is a graph from that. They compiled data from economic stimulus packages around the world, and Japan actually received a negative score under the Brown contribution investment category, despite having the third largest initial COVID-19 economic stimulus. Overall, Japan's nationally determined contributions, NDCs, were highly criticized by the international community when they were submitted to the UN in March 2020. Despite the growing urgency of the climate crisis, the country committed to the same 26% emissions reduction target that initially set out in 2015. That has since been upgraded to a 46% commitment, with an aim to maybe even increase it to 50% reduction by 2030. But the climate action trackers at the time rated Japan as highly insufficient, meaning that if all parties NDCs received this rating, total global warming would reach between 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, which is greatly out of the 1.5 degree limit that was set by the Paris Agreement. And this is unsurprising, as these goals were set without any major change in environmental or energy policy at the time. So the combination of the COVID-19 climate change means that the post-pandemic recovery is kind of a decisive moment for mitigating the impact of climate change, and a more ambitious approach to climate policy is evidenced by Japan's newest commitments following the early stages of the pandemic. Japan has since committed $19.6 billion to clean energy, with no additional public funding commitments for coal, according to the Energy Policy Tracker. And $18.73 billion is earmarked for continuous funding of innovative technology development. And the new Energy and Industrial Technology Development Organization, or NIDO, will carry out the development in priorities areas, including decarbonization, decarbonizing electricity, achieving a transformative hydrogen-based society, carbon recycling, and R&D for technology development and implementation. I'll just go along a little further. There are a lot of challenges of the green growth strategy, however. There, overall, from my research and hearing just what from my interviews, there are just a lot of physical constraints in implementing renewables into the energy grid. There's also kind of too much of an emphasis on the future, on these like future numbers like 2030 to 2045, and not enough on the present. And while the green growth strategy includes large funds, these are over the course of 10 years. And so the annual amounts of investment may not be sufficient. There's no kind of plans to reduce transmission costs, especially when it comes to offshore wind in the green growth strategy. And overall, there's a strong emphasis on innovation and not using kind of existing technologies to tackle the problem. These two graphs are very busy, but the findings are from an integrated assessment model that shows the top industrial countries in different energy scenarios going forward in the future. So on the left show 2020, 2030, and 2050 zero carbon scenarios, and the right shows 2050 scenarios with different energy mixes. So despite Japan's resource constraints and public opposition over certain carbon removal technologies or nuclear, the declining population means that they'll have a lower energy demand in the future relative to other economies. So there's really a chance, despite the name of green growth, for Japan to adopt an almost growth neutral position and to embrace maybe even a degrowth strategy in terms of carbon emissions reductions. JERA, Japan's Energy for a New Era, an alliance between Tokyo Electric Power Group and Chubu Electric Power Group, announced an investment in a 600 megawatt wind energy project, for example. And as of March 8th, they submitted a primary environmental impact consideration document for a new offshore wind project to Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, MIPP. So there is kind of some action happening. So in closing, depending on which path is taken, there are many opportunities for US-Japan cooperation on technologies like green hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, as well as nuclear. And the US is proceeding with small modular reactor, SMR technology development, and there are other places for cooperation between Japan's NEXIP initiative and the US's GAIN initiative. On the other hand, Japan is research on hydrogen that can be shared with the US. Climate and disaster resilience is another area of cooperation from the experience in Tohoku and the earthquake. Japan has a lot of expertise in disaster preparedness and response that can be shared with the US as natural disasters due to climate change increase in frequency and intensity. The US and Japan can also coordinate on supporting low carbon development in developing countries with financing mechanisms like the IMF or the World Bank, and with Japan being the largest contributor to the ADB, the Asian Development Bank. One nascent area that Japan could be leading on is in building climate resilience in countries like in Southeast Asia through nature-based solutions. And the ADB recognized this in a report citing a Global Commission on Adaptation study that estimates investing $1.8 trillion globally over the next decade in building up climate and disaster resilience could create $7.1 trillion in new benefits. And Japan already has experienced in this with the support of nature-based solutions implemented through the Building Back Greener post-disaster recovery plan following the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And just one concept I want to highlight that was echoed in a lot of the interviews was the concept, this gaiatsu, or external pressure from the US on Japan. And I think that was really evident in the climate summits and the goal of the climate summits. So I'll end there. There is an update, of course, because there was just a climate conference, but I can go on to open it to questions.
Thank you, Emma. There was another thorough examination of this issue. So since we do not have much time, I will just combine the two questions I tried to ask, and you can make a question, answer or response quickly, one of the two, or just both very briefly. So one of the questions is that, as you said, the Japanese, and also I researched recently to talk about this issue, that Japanese people are not so concerned with the environment compared with other developed countries. So I wonder what is the way for the Japanese government to motivate the people, majority of the Japanese people, to support this green growth strategy. So this is one thing, that the strategy. The second is that I'm sure that there are the conflict or the competition between the MIPP and the Ministry of Environment. And I wonder how they coordinate the disagreement between the two, or is there any organization that really coordinate the difference between the two? I'm sure that these two are not always in line. Thank you.
Sure, yeah, I'll try to answer both quickly in one. First, I might actually kind of dispute the first as climate being not prioritized by the public. There was a Pew study done in 2020, I think, that showed that 2/3 of adults in Japan said that they think climate should be prioritized. And a majority also said that they think that the government was not doing enough to reduce the effects of climate change. And similarly, I think about 60% of the people said that that climate change is currently affecting where they live. And the most recent, the IPCC AR6 report that came out this summer kind of showed with more precision how climate change is impacting people, even on a regional basis, especially with the experience of Japan with all the floods. Also, I just want to note that the election this past fall was actually very close. It went to a runoff, right, with Konotaro, who is on the Climate Advisory Board and has been a champion of renewable energy initiatives. So I think the public support is actually there. It's just, a matter of the leadership. And also I think Japan faces the biggest challenges they face are kind of these physical and resource constraints. Yeah, that answered, I guess.
Okay. Yes, please.
Yeah.
Okay, so is it okay that did you answer the second question kind of combined?
I think
okay.
But
okay,
yeah.
That's great. Yeah, thank you very much, Emma. I think that we have a little bit of behind the schedule, so I will move on to the third presentation. Thank you, Emma, and I will welcome Monica. Hi, thank you, Monica. So Monica's presentation is that examining the case for indigenous rights in Japan. Monica is a second-year master student at SAIS with a dual concentration in Japan studies and conflict management. She is a past Reischauer Policy Research Fellow, and currently she serves as the Student Conference Chair. Thank you, Monica, and please start.
Thank you. So let me start. So I'm going over Japanese indigeneity and global movements. And so I'm specifically focusing on the Ainu. So my argument is that there is a need to recognize indigeneity as an ongoing and growing issue in Japan. So the reality is that there are indigenous ethnic groups in Japan. And so specifically focus on the Ainu, indigenous status has been established within the last 10 years or so. However, there's still soft rules in place and there's no regional or national campaigns that really promote Ainu rights and self-determination. And then particularly since 2014, there's been ongoing pushback and denialism of this. So I kind of close with looking at the viability of the future and how that can be promoted and how indigenous identity in Japan really can be sought after is a reliance on self-identity, national recognition, and international cooperation. So again, looking at indigeneity in Japan, so you have three main ethnic groups in Japan. You have the Wajin, the Yamamoto, whoever you think of as being Japanese. Then you have the Ainu, who live in Hokkaido, Ezo, but just historically northern Honshu. And then you have the Uchinanchu in the Ryukyu Islands and Okinawa. And so especially particularly for the last two ethnic groups, there's a lack of right to self-determination, land and collective rights. And particularly for the Uchinanchu, there's issues in terms of land rights. So focusing on the Ainu, they're historically hunter-gatherer society, which are stratified by gender. They're focused in Hokkaido, also in the Kuril Islands and Sakhalin, although these populations have more or less disappeared for the most part. As of 2017, the stated population was 13,000 people. However, because it's done through a process of self-identification, registering through local Ainu organizations, it's unclear. And so it's actually estimated to be closer to 200,000 people. And then, so there are several Ainu dialects. However, the one that is most recognized is the Hokkaido dialect. So there are still 8 or 9 Hokkaido dialects remaining. However, dialects outside of Hokkaido has mainly disappeared, and it's estimated that there's only 15 fully native speakers of Ainu remaining in Japan. And so you saw this colonization and dissolution of rights under the Japanese Empire over hundreds of years. So by the 1400s, there was unofficial influence by the Bakufu during the Edo period. And so in 1868, Ezo was annexed by Japan and renamed Hokkaido. So after this, kind of following in the American Empire and their process of assimilation, colonization, and genocide of Native American culture, you saw that Ainu were also forced to become Japanese citizens without their consent. And then there was forced removal from their traditional cultures and lands over the next 30, 40 years. So there was a development commission from 1869 to 1882 that established these things, making people go to farming, removing them from traditional lands, parceling out lands to Japanese settlers within Hokkaido and things like that. And then by 1899, the Ainu were referred to as formal Aborigines. So they were no longer considered a separate ethnic group. They were within the Japanese Empire. And so at the same rate, there was forced lifestyle changes, and they had 8 years to farm the land that was given to them or lose land rights. However, these lands were given to them after the government and Japanese settlers had been prioritized. So the land was the worst and hardest to farm. So many of them did lose these land rights. Throughout the 20th century, you saw both the further assimilation of Ainu, as well as a lot of pushback against that, people collecting it, Ainu specialists kind of working together, and the development of Ainu movements. However, looking at the status rights, you saw in 1997, the Nibutani Dam decision was the most important one because it was the first time that Ainu were recognized as indigenous within Japan when their sacred lands were flooded. And so a Sapporo district court settled in the Ainu's favor, saying that they did have the right to these lands in the future, despite the lands previously being flooded. There was a 1997 law, which was important because it replaced the formal Aborigines Act. So nothing had been done in 100 years. However, it was more superficial and just addressed culture, not anything more serious than that. In 2008, one of the most important things was the official recognition of Indigenous status through the United Nations. However, it was non-binding on Japan's part, but it was very critical. In 2016, you saw the Hate Speech Recognition Act, which was the first post-war anti-racist legislation on recommendation from the UN, which was very important. And in 2019, you've seen the Ainu Policies Promotion Act of 2019, which in comparison to the 2008 one was binding and created an environment conducive to cultural promotion and had a lot more policy in terms of education and actual self-determination. So again, under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it declared the right to self-determination, the right to be recognized as distinct peoples, the right to free, prior and informed consent, and the right to be free of discrimination. So this was very critical in ensuring that the Ainu were officially recognized as their own independent ethnic group and not simply a part of the larger Japanese things where they had no rights to define anything that they would want from the government, regardless of historical considerations. So then at the same time, you've been seeing a reduction and a pushback of indigeneity in Japan. So hate speech since 2014 has gone up. There's one particular Hokkaido statesperson that is very volatile and writes a lot of hate speech on Twitter particularly, but also does this in a lot of his campaign speeches as well. Pushing people down, saying that it's not real, arguing the validity of these people, and separate things like that. There's been anti-Ainu protests in Tokyo, as well as a comedian earlier this year called an Ainu woman a dog. So in terms of textbook revisionism, similar to the United States, there was an expropriation of land, turns into giving land to Ainu people rather than their land was taken away and then re-given to them. One of the major considerations for the Ainu community is the reparation of ancestral remains. In the 1920s through the 50s, there was scientific experiments looking at the differences between the ethnicities. And so bodies were dug up and then used by universities for scientific studies. And so there's still over 1,500 Ainu human remains stored at 12 universities. So it's an ongoing campaign to retrieve these and return them to Ainu communities. And then you have the universalist racism, which says that kind of no real Ainu exists today. People have been assimilated to Japanese society. There's no real need to distinguish the Ainu. That prioritizing Ainu and the recognition of that ignores other marginalized groups. And it's more important to do that rather than recognize any kind of pushback of Ainu culture. And so then one of the main ways that the Ainu community has branched out is through both Ainu associations through Hokkaido and the rest of Japan, particularly in Tokyo, where there's been a lot of immigration, as well as global solidarity. So you see this with Okinawans, with the Umano Kai group as of 2015, and they're both also present at the UN World Conference of Indigenous Peoples. The Maori, who have had a very successful Indigenous movement to kind of reestablish Maori culture there. So there's kind of exchange that happen through both organizations. In Hawaii in particular is the use of language programs. In the 1970s, there was only 50 Native Hawaiian speakers under the age of 18, and this has been revitalized. So there's now several thousand, and it's a growing population, which is a great thing. And then there's also international organizations, including, again, the UN Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues and the Asia Indigenous Peoples Act that many Ainu utilize. And so in terms of the viability of future resiliency, at the local level, you've seen the Hokkaido University establish a Department of Ainu and Indigenous Studies as of 2019. And then previously in 2010, there was the RESPA scholarship that functioned as a promotion of Ainu culture and scholarship. And as of a 2013 survey conducted by Hokkaido's Office of Ainu Measures Promotion, 64% of Ainu people said they either want to proactively learn the Ainu language or want to learn the language if they are provided with opportunities. However, there is not a critical mass of speakers, so the language is in dire need of support. One of the biggest movements was the 2020 creation and opening of the Upopoi Museum, which is the first national museum focused on Ainu issues. So it's focused on sharing continuous cultural history. There's lobbying for official language status. Everything is presented in both Japanese, Ainu, and English, and it's been developed using those strategies that were utilized in Hawaii and continue to be utilized there. And furthermore, one of the main things that many people want to think about moving forward is this idea of harmony that's been promoted by Dr. Jirota Kitahara, who is an Ainu specialist. And so then that's recognizing the existence of minorities. And then once recognition has been established, making concessions in favor of those minorities. And then third, normalizing the reality of ethnic minorities. And this pertains particularly to the Ainu in Japan. So in closing, this is all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. That was very interesting for me personally, because I did not pay so much attention to the minorities in Japan. And it is refreshing to see that the people outside of Japan see the issues in Japan and try to see the issue from the different angle from the Japanese people, as Emma and Vivian all did. So, and again, the time is a little bit pushing. So I will ask the question that, again, this is a little bit the minority issue, and not many people, Japanese people, see the issue as colonization, kind of like the framing is different from Japanese people. So I wonder, what is the best way for the Ainu people or minorities in Japan to really convince the Japanese majorities that this is actually important for you, not just for us, but for you? What would you say? Well, what kind of framing would you use to mobilize the majorities?
I'd say that it's a matter of almost historical revisionism to a certain extent. I mean, Ainu history is Japanese history. It's integrally combined. So by not teaching that, you're not teaching all of Japan's history. And Hokkaido is a major part of Japan. It's a major agricultural producer. And there's a lot of ties. I think that Ainu culture has kind of seen this revival, and hopefully the national identification of Ainu culture, especially within the cabinet and upper levels, because there are policy groups being formed and that have been working closely with the government, have informed this. But I don't necessarily think it's also Ainu people's job to convince the Japanese government that they have a place to exist. I think that they deserve to be there regardless. And so I think mainly, I think education is a critical tool in this. And so restoring visibility and power for them to be able to speak their own truths and their own history. And so I think that this, you can look at it even in the context of Washington, D.C. Two of our most famous rivers, the Anacostia and the Potomac, are native names that we have used. So I think it's important to recognize that people shouldn't have to fight for their rights, and obviously they do, but they're an integral part of society. And I think that by including them, you will have a better understanding of ethnic relations and kind of identity in Japan.
Thank you, Monica. That is a thorough and comprehensive answer to my question. Thank you. So I will complete the panel too here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for your moderation of today's panels. So Dr. Brooks, Dr. Sasaki, would either of you like to add any final remarks to the research presented today?
Yeah, let me just give a sort of a very, very broad impression. From the government's standpoint, diplomacy, security, the first panel focused on those two areas. And we see a proactive approach. We see rapid responses. And the second panel, which were domestic, immigration, the climate problem, the change, minority rights, we see the government behind the curve, too little, too late, if anything. And of course, the legacy of history in terms of the Ainu. So on the spot, I think there should be a squeaky wheel model. And the squeaky wheel has to be public opinion. You can't rely on those politicians. You can't rely on the government. The bureaucrats are going to just do what they have to do. There has to be strong public opinion and a strong media. And based on my experience over the years, Japanese media has become weaker and weaker and weaker in terms of promoting public interests and allowing change to occur or forcing changes to occur. You know, on minority rights, you can read the newspapers all the time. I know nothing in there. So that's the problem, I think. The public opinion is shaped by the media, or should be shaped by the media. To a certain extent it is, but it doesn't have the kind of power or pressure levers, and the media has to be indeed the strong force to push that direction. The politicians are just not doing it. Sasaki sensei.
Yeah, thank you. So my concluding remark is this, that these are all important, particularly because you are seeing Japan from outside, right? So yes, Japanese people, some people may paying attention to these issues, but very narrow. And also we need some different perspective to deal with these issues. And all of you, the panelists, gave us a really different and fresh angles to see the issues. I'm sure that they are very helpful for Japan to tackle these issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sasaki sensei, and thank you very much, panelists, authors. We had a great show, and I really learned a lot. I love to go to a conference where I come back and say, I didn't know that, now I know. Usually I go to the conference and say, well, I knew that already. No, today I learned something. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Brooks. Again, thanks to you both, Dr. Sasaki and Dr. Brooks, for being our lovely moderators today. I would like to thank everyone actually attending today's event, in addition to our viewers. And then additionally, I'd like to thank our students for their hard work throughout the year and for their willingness to come back after half a year of doing their research to present today. Additionally, thanks to the Reischauer Center, particularly Center Director Dr. Kent Calder and Executive Director Neave Denny for this Yearbooks conference, as well as Reischauer Policy Fellow Hannah Lord. Thank you all for attending today's event. We now conclude it. Thank you so much.